The rain had just begun to fall in Huntsville, Texas, that September evening in 2012. Inside the Texas State Penitentiary's death chamber, the atmosphere was unnervingly calm. Sterile, white walls, bright lights, the faint hum of the air conditioning. On the gurney lay a man who had been called many things: a monster, a killer, a broken soul. Robert Wayne Harris turned his head slightly toward the witnesses and spoke softly. "I'm going home. God bless, and the Texas Rangers." It was a strange farewell for someone about to take his final breath, a mixture of resignation and defiance. Moments later, the lethal injection began to flow, but this ending, cold and clinical, was the last act in a story that had begun decades earlier, in a childhood scarred by violence. Harris's earliest memories were not of toys or school, but of blood. At the age of 4, he witnessed a horror no child should see. His father shot his mother dead and then turned the gun on himself. That day, any sense of security or innocence shattered for young Robert. He grew up shuttled between relatives, never finding stability, and by the time he was in school, teachers described him as withdrawn, often aggressive, and unable to keep up in class. He was placed in special education, but the interventions never seemed to stick. As he grew older, trouble became second nature. Harris drifted into petty crime, often in and out of juvenile detention. By his 20s, he was well known to local police, a man with no steady job, no home of his own, and a deep-seated anger simmering beneath the surface. That anger would eventually erupt in ways no one could have imagined. In 1999, Harris committed his first known murder. The victim was Sandra Scott, a woman he accused of stealing from him. What started as confrontation escalated into abduction and killing. The body was discovered dumped in a secluded area. Though police had their suspicions, they didn't yet have enough to bring a solid case. Harris walked free, but the taste of killing and the way it seemed to give him a sense of power would haunt the months that followed. By March of 2000, Harris was working at the MIT Fine Car Wash in Irving, Texas. It was a modest job, but even that would not last. One day, he was caught exposing himself to a female coworker, a humiliation that led to his immediate firing. That humiliation quickly curdled into rage. Harris believed that his termination was more than just punishment for his actions. It was a personal betrayal. In his mind, those who had crossed him needed to pay. And Harris was not thinking about confronting them with words. He was thinking about blood. The plan formed quickly. Harris returned to the car wash armed, intent on robbery, but it became something much darker. One by one, he shot and killed the people who had worked alongside him, the ones who had laughed with him, perhaps even pitied him. In total, 5 were murdered that day, each life extinguished in a matter of moments. The scene that police later found was chilling. Bodies sprawled across the workplace, bullet casings scattered, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. When investigators closed in, Harris didn't run far. He was arrested shortly after, and the confession came quickly, almost casually. There was no deep remorse, just a blunt acknowledgement of what he had done. The evidence was overwhelming, the brutality undeniable. From that moment, Harris's path toward death row was set. And yet, this was just the beginning of the long, winding road that would take more than a decade, through courtroom battles, failed appeals, and claims of mental disability, before the man who once wielded a gun in rage would lie strapped to a gurney, whispering his final, curious goodbye. In the days after his arrest, the details of Robert Wayne Harris's life began to emerge like pieces of a grim puzzle. Neighbors recalled him as a man who could be oddly polite one moment and explosively violent the next. Former co-workers spoke of a temper that could flare without warning. Those who had known him in childhood remembered the tragedy that defined his early years, though most agreed that while trauma could wound a person deeply, it didn't excuse what he had done. Prosecutors soon learned that Harris's deadly outburst at the MIT Fine Car Wash wasn't an isolated act of violence. There was Sandra Scott, just 37 years old when her life ended at his hands. In December 1999, Harris suspected she had stolen his truck. In his world, suspicion was as good as proof. Witnesses would later testify that he lured her into his car, drove her to a remote field, and shot her. The killing was methodical, cold, and silent. No one heard the gunshot. No one saw her last moments except Harris himself. Her body lay hidden until police found it days later, her death largely overshadowed by the crimes that would soon follow. After Sandra Scott's murder, Harris returned to his routine, or at least what passed for one. He drank heavily, drifted between odd jobs, and occasionally stayed with acquaintances. The car wash became one of the few stable fixtures in his life, but that stability crumbled when his reckless behavior caught up to him. The day of his firing in March 2000, Harris left with humiliation burning in his chest. He knew he was already walking on thin ice with the law, and now even the low-paying work that kept him afloat was gone. Over the next several days, Harris stewed in his anger. Some said he felt cheated, others that he simply wanted money. But his own words in later interviews hinted at something darker, a need to strike back, to show he couldn't be humiliated without consequence. He knew when the employees would be at work, who might resist him, and where he could corner them. On March 17, 2000, Harris arrived at the car wash armed with a .38 caliber revolver. The robbery began quickly, but witnesses who survived said it was clear from the start that Harris wasn't just there for cash. He ordered workers to lie on the ground, shot them point blank, and moved with a chilling sense of control. 5 people died that morning: Anthony Rogers, Dennis Lee, Everett Brown, Dennis Tate, and Gwendolyn Williams. 2 others were injured but survived, their testimonies later becoming key in court. By the time police arrived, Harris was gone, leaving behind a scene that would haunt detectives for years. Shell casings littered the wet pavement, blood pooled beneath lifeless bodies, and the smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Irving's small police force was left scrambling to piece together what had just happened and why. It wouldn't take them long to find him. It didn't take long for detectives to track him down. The surviving witnesses had described him in chilling detail: the voice, the way he moved, even the smirk he wore as he pulled the trigger. Tips began to pour in, and one led officers to a small apartment where Harris had been lying low. When the police surrounded the building, Harris didn't stage a dramatic standoff. He opened the door as if expecting them. Inside, they found not only the revolver used in the killings, but also blood-stained clothes stuffed in a bag. There was no elaborate alibi, no attempt to spin a story. In fact, Harris seemed almost detached as he admitted what he had done. "Yes, I shot them," he told investigators, his voice flat. There was no tremor of regret, no hint of panic. It was as if he were recounting something mundane, like explaining how to change a tire. Detectives, hardened by years of violent crime, later admitted that his calmness was unsettling. The case moved swiftly. The murders had shocked the quiet community of Irving, Texas. These weren't hardened criminals or people caught up in gang rivalries. The victims were ordinary working people, men and women who had shown up for their shift on a Friday morning, never imagining it would be their last day alive. Prosecutors wasted no time building their case. They charged Harris with capital murder, knowing that in Texas, that meant the death penalty was firmly on the table. During the trial, jurors were shown photos of the crime scene, images so graphic that several members of the jury had to look away. The prosecution painted Harris as a remorseless killer, someone who had not only taken lives, but had done so in cold blood, with deliberate intent. The defense team tried a different approach. They pointed to Harris's traumatic childhood, his limited intellectual abilities, and his history of mental health problems. His IQ, they claimed, was measured at 68, below the threshold that the U.S. Supreme Court had previously ruled made someone ineligible for execution under Atkins v. Virginia. They argued that Harris was a broken man, long before the killings, shaped by violence, neglect, and instability. But the jury was unmoved. In 2000, they found Harris guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to die by lethal injection. For the families of the victims, it was a moment of justice, though for some, it felt hollow. No sentence could bring their loved ones back. Harris was transferred to Texas's death row in Livingston, where he would spend the next 12 years. Life on death row was slow, monotonous, and suffocating. 23 hours a day locked inside a small cell, with 1 hour allowed for recreation in a concrete pen. Prison staff described him as quiet, often keeping to himself, occasionally reading, sometimes praying, but his attorneys kept fighting. They filed appeals claiming racial bias in the jury selection and again raising the issue of his mental capacity. In 2012, just days before his scheduled execution, they took the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The justices, without comment, denied his appeal. The final date was set for September 20th, 2012. When the news reached Harris, said he simply nodded, as if he had been expecting it all along. In his final days, he received visits from friends and family members. There were no emotional outbursts, no desperate pleas for clemency, only quiet conversations and the occasional smile. Outside the prison walls, the families of his victims prepared themselves for the day they had waited more than a decade to see. Inside, Robert Wayne Harris counted down his final hours in the place where every tick of the clock was a reminder that time was running out. September 20th, 2012. The air in Huntsville was heavy with the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. For Robert Wayne Harris, it was the day he had been walking toward for 12 long years. Guards moved quietly through the corridors that morning, their boots echoing against the concrete floors as they approached his cell. There was no rush. In this place, everything happened with precise, almost ceremonial order. Harris was awake before dawn. He had spent the night lying on the narrow prison bed, staring at the ceiling, perhaps replaying moments from his life, or maybe trying not to think at all. Breakfast came and went, untouched. A chaplain visited, offering scripture and prayer, and Harris listened silently, nodding occasionally. Shortly before noon, the prison kitchen prepared what would be his last meal. Texas had recently abolished the tradition of allowing death row inmates to choose their final meal after one prisoner's excessive order went untouched, so Harris received the standard fare: a tray of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, and tea. He ate slowly, almost mechanically, finishing most of it. Throughout the day, Harris met with a handful of visitors, friends and relatives who had stood by him despite his crimes. Behind the thick glass of the visitation room, they spoke through phones, their words muffled to outside ears. Some told him they forgave him, others simply said goodbye. One friend pressed his hand against the glass, holding it there for a long moment, before the guard signaled that time was up. By late afternoon, the execution team was preparing the death chamber. The gurney was wheeled into place, leather straps checked and adjusted. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled the air. In a separate room, witnesses began to gather: reporters, relatives of the victims, prison officials. Just after 6 p.m., Harris was led into the chamber. He walked without resistance, his expression calm. He wore a crisp white prison uniform, his wrists and ankles shackled until the moment he lay down on the gurney. Guards secured the straps across his chest, arms, and legs. A medical technician swabbed his arms before inserting 2 IV lines, one in each arm, the tubes leading to bags of clear liquid that would end his life. When the warden asked if he had a final statement, Harris turned his head toward the glass, looking at the witnesses. His voice was steady. "I'm going home. God bless and the Texas Rangers." The remark seemed to hang in the air for a moment, puzzling some, angering others. It was short, almost casual, no apology, no direct mention of the people he had killed. Then he closed his eyes. At 6:13 p.m., the lethal injection began. The first drug, a powerful sedative, quickly made his breathing slow. Within seconds, his eyelids fluttered, his head tilted slightly to the side, and his chest rose and fell for the last time. At 6:28 p.m., the warden pronounced him dead. In the witness room, there was no cheering, no applause. Some family members of the victims cried quietly. Others stared at the gurney, their faces unreadable. For them, justice had been served, but the hole left in their lives would never truly close. Outside the prison, reporters delivered live updates as the sun dipped below the horizon. The execution of Robert Wayne Harris became just another headline in Texas's long history of capital punishment. But for those who had lived through his violence, the echoes of that day would remain for years to come. When the doors to the death chamber closed for the last time that evening, the families of Harris's victims stepped out into the cool Texas night. For more than a decade, they had carried the weight of what had happened at the Mighty Fine car wash. Some had lost fathers, brothers, or lifelong friends in an instant. Others had carried survivors' guilt, wondering why they had been spared when others were not. For Anthony Rogers' mother, the execution was not about revenge. Standing before reporters, she said in a trembling voice, "I don't feel joy tonight. I just feel finished. My son's gone and nothing will change that. But maybe now I can sleep without seeing his face in my dreams every night." Other family members spoke of closure, though the word seemed too small for the years of grief and anger. One sister of a victim said, "You can't just erase this pain, but you can stop it from spreading." And that's what today was. It was stopping him from ever hurting anyone again. Back in Irving, the car wash where the massacre took place had long since changed owners, but locals still remembered the day it became a crime scene. Some said they avoided driving past it. Others couldn't help but slow down and glance at the spot where sirens had once wailed, where a normal Friday morning had turned into chaos. Harris's execution didn't just end his life. It reignited a familiar debate in Texas and across the country. Should a man with a low IQ be put to death? His attorneys had argued for years that his intellectual disability should make him ineligible under the 2002 Atkins v. Virginia ruling. They pointed to school records, psychological evaluations, and his history of special education placement. But prosecutors countered that Harris's planning of the robbery and ability to evade capture proved he knew exactly what he was doing. The Texas courts sided with the state, and when the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene, the decision was final. For death penalty opponents, Harris's case became another example of the flaws they see in the system. For supporters, it was proof that justice could still be carried out even in complex cases. In the months that followed, the case faded from national headlines, replaced by other crimes, other trials, other executions. But for those directly touched by Harris's violence, the impact didn't fade at all. Survivors of the attack, who had testified against him, admitted that their lives had never returned to normal. One man who was injured in the shooting said in an interview years later, "It's like a shadow that follows you. You go to work, you hear a loud noise, and your heart jumps. You think about that day every single time." Harris himself left behind little beyond the court records and news articles that chronicled his life. He had no children, no spouse, no diary to explain what he had done or why. The only words he left on record at the moment of his death were those brief, cryptic ones in the execution chamber. Perhaps that was fitting. From the day he pulled the trigger in March 2000 to the moment the lethal injection took hold, Harris had never truly explained himself. He had admitted the killings without remorse, fought his legal battles without public statements, and met his end without apology. For Texas, his execution was one of many in a long, unbroken history of capital punishment. For the families, it marked the end of a legal process that had consumed their lives for 12 years. And for those who still drive past that quiet car wash in Irving, It is a reminder that violence can erupt anywhere, that lives can change in seconds, and that sometimes, even when justice is served, the pain never really goes away.